Shropshire, 1945. The gates of Camp 23 swung open under a sky threatening rain, the air thick with the smell of wet canvas and coal fires. Through the entrance, German women marched in formation, their eyes scanning the compound for what awaited them inside. They had been told what to expect from British military camps. Slovenliness, the casual disorder that propaganda claimed defined democratic armies, soldiers who slouched and smoked on duty, uniforms worn without pride or discipline. What they saw instead made them stop mid-stride. British guards stood at precise intervals, uniforms immaculate despite the drizzle, posture perfect, boots polished to mirror shine, every button gleaming, every crease sharp enough to cut. For a moment, the only sound was rain beginning to fall. Everything they had been taught about British military standards, about the superiority of German discipline, about the inevitable decay of democratic forces, was about to collapse. The men guarding them looked like they were preparing for inspection by the king himself. The journey had begun 5 weeks earlier on a frozen morning outside Cologne. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person who keeps history alive. So do me one favor, tap like so this story isn't buried, show support by subscribing so you don't miss the next chapter, and share this video so more people discover the truth history tried to hide. Katharina Vogel stood among 220 women in a requisitioned school building, her Luftwaffe auxiliary uniform still bearing the insignia she'd worn while coordinating aircraft maintenance schedules across 3 airfields. She was 29, an administrator who had managed logistics for fighter squadrons from France to Poland for 4 years. Around her, secretaries, telephone operators, warehouse supervisors, even a dress designer from Berlin who had been conscripted to manage uniform production, all captured as Allied forces rolled through the Rhineland. They had expected summary execution. The propaganda had been categorical. The British were undisciplined rabble, barely organised, certainly incapable of maintaining proper military standards. If they took prisoners at all, those prisoners would be dumped into chaos, into camps run by men who didn't understand order or protocol. Instead, they received medical examinations, delousing procedures, and grey dresses stamped with POW in black ink. The letters felt like a sentence without an end date. The Channel crossing was brutal beyond imagination. Seasickness that turned stomachs inside out. Cold that made joints ache. Darkness broken only by the occasional flash of a guard's torch. Women clung to whatever surfaces they could find, some praying to gods they'd stopped believing in, others silent with the exhaustion of those who'd already surrendered to whatever came next. Katharina kept a pencil stub and scraps of paper hidden in her dress pocket, writing by whatever light she could steal. March 15th, 1945. We crossed to Britain now. The propaganda said British camps would be disorganised, chaotic, run by men without discipline. I fear what chaos means for women prisoners. The English damp was different from German cold when the ship docked at Liverpool. Not sharp, but penetrating, working through fabric, through skin, settling into lungs and bones. Grey sky merged with grey water, merged with grey docks in endless monochrome. Women stumbled down gangways on legs that had forgotten how to be solid, blinking in light that seemed filtered through layers of moisture and fatigue. British soldiers lined the dock. This was the first shock. They weren't lounging or smoking or displaying the casual disorder promised by propaganda. They stood in formation, proper military bearing, uniforms that looked freshly pressed despite the damp. One sergeant, his uniform showing medal ribbons from North Africa and Italy, inspected them with eyes that missed nothing. Not threatening, just professional, exacting. He noticed a German woman who could barely walk, gestured to a medic, had her examined and treated before she could collapse. The efficiency was unsettling. This wasn't the disorder they'd been promised. This was precision. The transport trucks were military standard, canvas covered, benches bolted in rows. They drove south through countryside that seemed impossibly green even in March. Rolling hills, hedgerows just beginning to bud, villages with stone buildings that looked like they'd stood for centuries. Everything was neat, ordered, maintained. Fences straight, fields tended, roads clear of rubble. None of the chaos visible in Germany, where infrastructure crumbled and order dissolved. This was a country that still functioned, still believed in maintaining standards even while fighting a war. "Why do they look like that?" whispered Sophie Müller in German. She was 23, a secretary from Dresden, still young enough to believe in the absolutes she'd been taught. The guards, their uniforms, the propaganda said British soldiers were slovenly. No one answered. The British guards riding in the truck didn't speak to them, but their silence was different than expected. Not hostile, just professional distance. When the journey stretched past 6 hours and women needed facilities, guards arranged proper stops, provided privacy, maintained dignity. These weren't the actions of undisciplined men. These were procedures followed precisely because procedures mattered. Camp 23 emerged from Shropshire countryside like something from a different world. Rows of Nissen huts arranged in perfect geometric order, wire fences strung with mathematical precision, pathways raked and maintained, not a single piece of paper or debris visible anywhere. Guard towers stood at intervals, and the men inside moved through their duties with clockwork regularity. Sign changes happened at exact times. Patrols followed precise routes. Nothing was casual. Nothing was approximate. Everything was exact. The camp commandant was a British colonel named Arthur Pemberton. This man embodied everything the women thought impossible. He stood on the headquarters steps as trucks arrived, and his appearance was flawless. Uniform pressed until every crease was architectural. Medals aligned with micrometer precision. Shoes polished to reflection. His posture was parade ground perfect. Hands clasped behind his back at exactly the regulation angle. He looked like a recruiting poster come to life. "You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention," he said through a translator, an Austrian woman who had fled to Britain in 1938. His voice carried authority without harshness, each word enunciated with precision. "You will maintain camp regulations. You will work assigned duties. You will conduct yourselves with appropriate military bearing. We expect from you the same standards we maintain ourselves." The German women stood in formation, rain beginning to fall harder, trying to process these words. Military bearing, standards, from prisoners. He was talking to them as if they were soldiers under his command, rather than defeated enemies. Colonel Pemberton dismissed them to barracks. The Nissen huts were military standard, but immaculately maintained. Bunks arranged in perfect rows, each with regulation bedding folded to exact dimensions. Footlockers aligned precisely. Floors swept clean. Small coal stoves positioned at measured intervals for heat. Everything demonstrated that someone cared about order, about maintaining standards even in a prisoner camp. And in each hut, posted prominently, a typewritten list of regulations. Not suggestions, regulations, with enforcement procedures clearly stated. "This is a trick," an older woman named Frau Steinberg muttered. "They show us order to make us trust them, then comes chaos." But the chaos never came. Morning arrived at 6 o'clock a.m. precisely. Roll call in the compound yard. Guards in formation taking count with methodical accuracy. Not approximate counts or quick estimates, but precise accounting. Each woman's number called, each response recorded. The process took 20 minutes, and not once did a guard check a watch or show impatience. This was the procedure. The procedure was followed. That was sufficient. The mess hall was where the second shock occurred. The building was a long Nissen hut with rows of tables set in perfect alignment, each table showing place settings arranged with geometric precision. Women filed in expecting whatever food came, assuming disorder would manifest here if anywhere. Instead, they found a serving line run with restaurant efficiency. Food portioned exactly. Trays handed over with 2 hands, properly. Servers who stood at attention between servings. The meal itself was basic. Porridge, bread, tea, but it was served with a precision that made it feel somehow formal. Katerina stared at her tray, noting how the porridge was centered, the bread placed at precise angle, the tea filled to consistent level. Around her, women ate in silence, confused by receiving not just food, but food presented as if they mattered, as if proper presentation was important, even for prisoners. One woman began crying quietly, overwhelmed not by cruelty, but by the cognitive dissonance of being treated with such exacting care. A British soldier, supervising the mess hall, noticed her tears. He approached, stood at a respectful distance, and asked through a German-speaking corporal if she was ill, if she needed medical attention. His concern was genuine, professional, delivered with the same precision as everything else. When she shook her head, unable to explain, he nodded, made a note on his clipboard, and returned to his duties. Every action measured, every interaction professional. Work assignments came after breakfast. Some women were sent to camp laundry, others to kitchens, still others to maintenance or administrative duties. Each assignment came with written instructions, typewritten, detailed, clear. Work hours were 8 o'clock a.m. to 5 o'clock p.m., with a 1-hour lunch break and 2 15-minute breaks at prescribed times. Supervisors were British soldiers who demonstrated each task once, expected comprehension, and inspected finished work with white-glove thoroughness. Not cruel, just exacting. Standards existed. Standards would be met. But it was the uniform protocol that became the defining feature of camp life. British guards rotated through duties with precision timing. Sign changes occurred exactly on schedule, each guard marching to his position with perfect military bearing, saluting the relieved guard, executing the changeover as if generals were watching. Uniforms were always immaculate, boots always polished, buttons always gleaming. These weren't men performing for inspection. This was simply how they conducted themselves every hour of every day. On the fourth day, something happened that crystallized the transformation. During morning roll call, one of the British guards appeared with a button missing from his uniform. Just one button, barely noticeable. But his sergeant spotted it immediately, called the guard aside after formation, and quietly but firmly sent him to correct the deficiency before returning to duty. The German women watched this in stunned silence. A guard disciplined for a missing button while overseeing prisoners. The message was clear. Standards applied to everyone. No exceptions, no relaxation, no casual acceptance of good enough. Katerina made a friend among the guards. Not precisely a friend. Boundaries remained absolute, but something like professional respect. His name was Sergeant Major Richard Thornton, a man of 45 with 3 wars in his service record and a bearing that suggested steel ran through his spine instead of bone. He managed the work details with the precision of a symphony conductor, every element coordinated, every timing exact. She encountered him one afternoon while working in the camp administrative office, filing paperwork that British bureaucracy demanded in triplicate. He entered to retrieve a form, moving with military efficiency, and noticed her struggling with the filing system that organized everything by regulation number, rather than alphabetically. "It's organized by regulation reference," he said, in careful German learned during occupation duty in the Rhineland after the First War. "Top to bottom by chapter, left to right by subsection. More logical, once you understand the system." She looked at him, this man who maintained perfect military bearing even when no one of rank was watching. "Why does it matter? We are prisoners. Why organize our files with such precision?" Thornton paused in his document search, considering the question with the same careful attention he gave everything. "Because standards are not situational. They apply regardless of circumstance. If we maintain order only when convenient, then we maintain nothing. It's either important or it isn't. In Germany, we were taught that British soldiers were undisciplined, that democratic armies couldn't maintain proper military standards without authoritarian command." Thornton's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. We maintain discipline because we choose to, not because someone forces us to. That's the difference. Discipline that comes from personal commitment is stronger than discipline imposed by fear. That conversation planted a seed that would grow through the following months. The German women watched British guards maintain their standards with unwavering consistency, watched uniforms stay immaculate in rain and mud, watched formation changes executed with parade ground precision during thunderstorms, watched soldiers maintain military bearing when exhausted, when sick, when no one of rank was present to enforce it. And gradually, the propaganda that had shaped their understanding began to dissolve. In April, the camp held its first inspection by a visiting general. The women expected guards to suddenly increase their standards, to put on a show for superior officers. Instead, nothing changed. The guards maintained exactly the same level of precision they showed every other day, because there was no inspection level above their normal standard. This was simply how they operated. The general walked through the camp with Colonel Pemberton, and Katerina's work detail was visible from the pathway. She watched as Pemberton answered questions about prisoner management, about work assignments, about camp operations. His responses were crisp, precise, delivered with the confidence of someone who knew every detail of his command. The general nodded, satisfied, and moved on. No drama, no spectacle, just competence confirmed. That evening, Sophie approached Katerina in their hut, confusion written on her young face. They didn't change anything for the inspection. The guards looked exactly the same as they do every day. How is that possible? Katerina had been thinking about this question for weeks. Because they believe in what they're doing. They maintain standards because standards matter to them, not because someone is watching. That's what we were never taught. That discipline can come from within rather than being imposed from above. The transformation happened slowly but inevitably. Women began to internalize the camp's ethos. They kept their bunks neat, not because anyone forced them, but because disorder felt wrong in this environment. They showed up to work assignments on time because punctuality was respected. They maintained their own appearance as best as possible with limited resources because the British example suggested that personal standards mattered, not to please guards, not to gain favour, but because they were beginning to understand that discipline and self-respect were connected. Frau Steinberg, who had initially dismissed everything as elaborate deception, became one of the most changed. She was assigned to work in the camp laundry, where British uniforms were cleaned and pressed. She learned the exacting standards required, how collars had to be starched just so, how trouser creases had to be sharp enough to cut, how every button had to be polished, how even the smallest stain was unacceptable. The British corporal supervising the laundry demonstrated these standards once, then expected them to be met. At first, Frau Steinberg resented the perfectionism. Then she began to take pride in meeting the standards. Then she began to exceed them, finding satisfaction in producing uniforms that could pass the most rigorous inspection. One day, the corporal inspected her work, nodded approval, and said simply, "Well done, proper standard." 3 words, but they carried weight. Recognition that she had met a real standard maintained by people who actually cared about excellence. One evening in May, she returned to the hut and sat on her bunk with an expression Katerina had never seen on her face before, contentment tinged with confusion. "I took pride in pressing British uniforms today," she said quietly. "I wanted them to be perfect. What is happening to me?" "You're remembering what pride in work feels like," Katerina replied. "Real pride, not the forced enthusiasm of propaganda, but genuine satisfaction in doing something well." Summer brought longer days and warmer weather. The camp's routine never varied. 6 o'clock a.m., roll call, precise meal times, structured work periods, evening free time, 10 o'clock p.m., lights out. But within that structure, Women began to find something unexpected. Security. They knew what to expect. They knew the standards. They knew that if they met expectations, they would be treated fairly. The consistency was liberating in a way that propaganda had never prepared them for. Sergeant Major Thornton continued managing work details with his characteristic precision. Over months, Katerina worked under his supervision regularly, and their professional relationship deepened into mutual respect. One afternoon, repairing a filing cabinet that had jammed, she asked him the question that had been growing in her mind. Why does uniform perfection matter so much? We are in the middle of nowhere, no parade ground, no public viewing. Why maintain such exacting standards when no one important is watching? Thornton considered this while testing the filing drawer she'd fixed. Because the moment you decide standards only matter when someone is watching, you've lost the standard entirely. Discipline maintained only under observation isn't discipline, it's performance. He paused. A properly maintained uniform tells everyone that you take your duty seriously, that you respect the institution you serve, that you respect yourself. It's not about looking good, it's about being someone who maintains standards because standards matter. In Germany, perfect uniforms were about projecting power, intimidating others, demonstrating superiority. Here, it's about self-respect and respect for the uniform. Big difference. One is about others' fear, the other is about personal integrity. Katerina was quiet, processing this distinction. When I served Germany, I took pride in precision because I thought it proved we were superior. Now I watch British soldiers maintain even higher standards, and they claim no superiority. They just do it because it's right. I don't know what to believe anymore. Believe what you see. We show you who we are every day, in every action. No speeches, no propaganda, just consistent behaviour. In July, something remarkable happened that tested everything the women had learned. A new batch of prisoners arrived, German men from recently captured units, including some officers who still believed Germany might somehow win. These men brought with them the old propaganda, the old certainties. British soldiers were undisciplined, British forces were weak, British camps would be chaotic. They lasted 3 days before reality overwhelmed their expectations. Katerina watched from her work detail as the new male prisoners went through the same process she had experienced. The shock of seeing immaculate uniforms, the confusion of being treated with procedural precision, the cognitive dissonance of finding order where they expected chaos. Some adjusted quickly, others clung to propaganda, insisting this was all elaborate deception. But the evidence accumulated daily. British guards maintaining standards, regardless of weather, regardless of observer, regardless of circumstance. One of the German officers, a captain named Weber, who had commanded an infantry company, sought out Katerina after learning she'd been in camp for months. "Is it always like this?" he asked. "The precision, the uniform standards, the unwavering routine?" "Yes, every single day, without exception." "But why? They've won. They have no one to impress. Why maintain such discipline?" "Because that's who they are. The discipline isn't for show. It's intrinsic." Weber was silent for a long moment. "We were told the British couldn't maintain proper military standards, that only authoritarian command could produce real discipline. But these men..." He gestured toward a guard patrol executing a formation change with parade ground precision. "They maintain higher standards than our own forces did, and they do it voluntarily." "That," Katerina said quietly, "is what I've been trying to understand for months." August brought news that the war had truly ended, that Japan had surrendered, that all fighting everywhere had finally stopped. At Camp 23, Colonel Pemberton called a full assembly. The women and men stood in separate formations, British guards at their posts maintaining the same perfect bearing they showed every other day, while Pemberton stood on a platform that had been erected overnight to regulation specifications. "The war is concluded," he said, and the translator rendered his words into German. Repatriation will occur over the coming year as logistics permit. Until departure, all camp regulations remain in effect. All standards will be maintained. He paused, looking over the assembled prisoners. I want you to understand something that matters more than you may realize. The prisoners listened in complete silence. The standards we maintain here are not arbitrary. They are not designed to impress you or control you. They exist because we believe that discipline, respect, and personal excellence are not negotiable based on circumstance. We maintain these standards during war and peace, when observed and when alone, for enemies and for friends, because who we are does not change based on convenience. His voice strengthened. Your government taught you that military discipline required authoritarian command, that democratic armies would inevitably decay into disorder. You have now lived among us long enough to see the truth. Discipline chosen is stronger than discipline imposed. Standards maintained from personal commitment outlast standards enforced by fear. Respect earned through consistency means more than respect demanded through intimidation. He gestured toward his guards. These men maintain perfect uniforms because they take pride in their service. They execute orders with precision because they believe in doing things correctly. They treat you with procedural fairness because they believe all human beings deserve consistent application of regulations. This is not performance, this is character. When you return to Germany, some will not believe you. Some will insist we were performing for you, that no military force maintains such standards without authoritarian control. But you have lived here. You know the truth. Tell them that discipline without fear is possible, that standards maintained from pride are achievable, that democratic societies can produce military forces as precise and professional as any authoritarian regime. More so, because our soldiers choose their discipline rather than having it beaten into them. That evening, many women reflected on their months at Camp 23. Katerina sat in her hut, writing in the diary she'd managed to maintain throughout captivity. Today, I understood that everything I believed about military discipline was incomplete. We were taught that discipline required fear, that without authoritarian command, soldiers would inevitably become slovenly. But British Guards maintain higher standards than we did, and they do it from personal commitment rather than fear of punishment. What does this mean for everything else we were taught? What other lies were we fed? Sophie, the young secretary from Dresden, sat nearby, polishing her shoes with blacking she'd been issued. Not because anyone required it, but because she'd absorbed the camp's ethos of maintaining standards. When I go home, she said quietly, and people ask about British camps, I'll tell them about the guards whose uniforms were always perfect, about the sergeant who was disciplined for a missing button, about standards maintained with unwavering consistency, and they won't believe me. Tell them anyway, Katerina replied. The truth matters even when people refuse to accept it. Repatriation began in October. Groups of prisoners were processed, given travel documents, loaded onto trucks heading south to ports. Katerina's group was scheduled for December, 9 months after her arrival. The final weeks felt strange. Women wandered the camp trying to memorize it, understanding they were leaving a place that had fundamentally changed their understanding of discipline, order, and what military professionalism could mean. The night before departure, several women sought out the guards who had supervised them, men they'd come to respect through months of consistent behavior. Frau Steinberg found the corporal who had supervised the laundry, who had taught her that excellence mattered even in mundane tasks. "I will remember what you taught me," she said through a translator. "That pride in work is about personal standards, not about performing for others. That doing something well matters regardless of who sees it." The corporal nodded, his posture as perfect as ever. "That's the lesson then. Take it home. Teach others." Sophie approached a young guard who had supervised her administrative work detail, who had maintained perfect military bearing even when exhausted from double shifts. You showed me that discipline can come from within, that people can maintain standards without being forced. I thought that was impossible before I came here." The guard smiled slightly. "We just show you what you're capable of when you decide standards matter. The choice is always yours." Katerina found Sergeant Major Thornton in the administrative office, filing paperwork with the same meticulous precision he showed in every task. "I need to thank you," she said. "Not for kindness exactly, but for consistency. For showing me that discipline maintained from pride is stronger than discipline enforced by fear. For teaching me that standards maintained regardless of circumstance define character." Thornton looked up from his filing, expression thoughtful. "You taught yourself. We just provided the environment. What you do with that knowledge now, that's up to you." "What do I do with the guilt?" "I served Germany enthusiastically. I maintained perfect records, perfect administration, perfect logistics. I was proud of my precision. But I put that precision in service of something terrible. Use it differently now. Apply the same dedication to excellence, but choose what you dedicate it to. Precision itself is neutral. It's what you build with it that matters." The morning of departure came cold and clear, December frost turning the compound white and crystalline. Women loaded their few possessions, some clothes, letters from home, and memories of 9 months spent learning that propaganda had lied about nearly everything. They formed up for final roll call, and British guards counted them with the same exactitude they'd shown every other morning. Then, Colonel Pemberton emerged from headquarters, uniform flawless as always, to personally oversee their departure. He walked along the formation, not inspecting, just acknowledging. When he reached Katerina, he stopped briefly. "I understand you work administrative detail. Your filing system organization has been exemplary. That standard will serve you well in whatever comes next." She was stunned that the commandant knew who she was, knew her work. "Thank you, sir. I learned from watching your soldiers. They taught me that standards maintained consistently become character." Pemberton nodded. "Precisely. Take that understanding home. Build with it." The trucks rolled out through gates that had defined their world for 9 months, past guard towers where sentries still stood at perfect attention, past barracks maintained with unwavering precision, carrying women who were returning to Germany as fundamentally different people than they'd been when they arrived. The journey back to Germany was long. Ships across the Channel, trains through France. Arriving finally in a country that resembled photographs of apocalypse more than a nation. Rubble everywhere. Infrastructure collapsed. People moving through ruins like ghosts. The occupation zones divided Germany among powers who would shape its future through different philosophies. But one thing was universal: disorder, chaos, the breakdown of systems that had once functioned with mechanical precision. Katerina returned to Cologne, now in the British occupation zone. Her family's apartment building was a skeleton, but her parents had survived in the basement. They embraced her, 3 people trying to reconnect across a gap wider than geography. That first night, by candlelight, she told them about Camp 23, about British guards whose uniforms were always perfect, about standards maintained with unwavering consistency, about discipline that came from pride rather than fear. "They treated you well?" her father asked, voice heavy with decades of propaganda. "They treated us with procedural correctness, always. And they showed us that military discipline doesn't require authoritarian command, that soldiers can maintain higher standards when they choose those standards rather than having them imposed by fear." In the months that followed, Katerina found work with the British occupation authorities. Her administrative precision and growing English made her valuable. She organised filing systems, managed records, coordinated logistics, and she maintained the standards she'd learned at Camp 23. Not because anyone forced her, but because she'd learned that excellence mattered regardless of circumstance. Her British supervisors noticed, respected her for it, trusted her with increasing responsibility. Sophie returned to Dresden, now in the Soviet zone where everything was chaotic. where systems barely functioned, where order was imposed through force rather than chosen through commitment. She found work in Reconstruction administration and brought to it the precision she'd learned in British captivity. Her filing systems worked, her records were accurate, her standards were high, and slowly, others began learning from her example. The lessons spread. Excellence through personal commitment worked better than adequacy through forced compliance. Frau Steinberg settled in Hamburg, also in the British zone, and opened a small tailor shop. She brought to it the exacting standards she'd learned pressing British uniforms. Every seam perfect, every button aligned precisely, every garment pressed to perfection. Her reputation grew. Customers came from across the city because they knew her work would be flawless. And when people asked where she learned such precision, she told them, from British soldiers who maintained perfect standards even when no one was watching, because that's who they were. Sergeant Major Thornton continued serving in Germany through the occupation years, working on military logistics and infrastructure reconstruction. He maintained his characteristic precision in everything, proving daily that standards need not relax just because circumstances were difficult. His German civilian employees learned from his example, internalizing the lesson that excellence chosen was more powerful than adequacy imposed. Colonel Arthur Pemberton rose to general rank, serving in NATO command, where his emphasis on maintaining standards through personal commitment rather than authoritarian control influenced an entire generation of officers. He rarely spoke about Camp 23, considering it simply duty performed to proper standard. But he kept letters from former prisoners, women who wrote describing how they'd applied the lessons learned, how they'd rebuilt their lives around principles of chosen discipline rather than imposed order. What happened at Camp 23 and similar facilities was not widely documented for decades. It didn't fit comfortable narratives about punishment and redemption, about victors and vanquished. But it was real. German POWs, including thousands of women, were held in British camps during the war's final years. Many camps maintained exacting military standards. Those encounters between women who had been taught that democratic armies were undisciplined and guards who maintained parade ground precision even in remote camps became an unexpected form of education. Historians later noted that German POWs held in British camps returned home with transformed perspectives about military discipline. They had experienced something that contradicted fundamental propaganda. Democratic soldiers maintaining higher standards than authoritarian forces. Discipline chosen rather than imposed. Excellence from personal commitment rather than fear of punishment. This experience didn't instantly create democrats, but it planted seeds of doubt about whether authoritarianism was necessary for order, whether discipline required fear, whether excellence demanded totalitarian control. The camp where Katharina Vogel spent 9 months no longer exists. The buildings were dismantled after the war, the land returned to farmland. If you visited the site today, you would see only fields, perhaps a memorial stone noting that a camp once stood there. But the impact of what happened in that space ripples forward. Every business Frau Steinberg built on principles of chosen excellence. Every filing system Sophie organized with precision, born from pride rather than fear. Every lesson Katharina taught about discipline coming from within rather than imposed from without. The German women who saw British guards in perfect uniforms expected nothing to challenge their worldview. They had been promised that democratic armies were inevitably slovenly, that only authoritarian command could maintain real discipline, that British forces would be disorganized chaos. What they experienced instead was precision that exceeded their own military standards, maintained consistently regardless of observer, arising from personal commitment rather than fear. And in that gap between expectation and reality, something fundamental shifted. Not dramatic, not cinematic, but real. People changed their assumptions. People learned to question their certainties. People chose to build their lives on different principles. That is the quiet victory that no propaganda can achieve. That is the transformation that happens, one perfectly pressed uniform at a time, one consistent action at a time, one moment of recognition that discipline chosen is stronger than discipline imposed. In the end, it wasn't British military superiority that defeated Nazi ideology in those women's hearts. It wasn't forced re-education or denazification lectures. It was the simple experience of living among soldiers who maintained higher standards than they'd been told possible, who demonstrated daily that democratic forces could excel through personal commitment rather than authoritarian control. That is the lesson that echoes across decades. That is the truth that survives when all the propaganda is forgotten. That is the hope that remains when everything else has been destroyed. Character is not determined by ideology, command structure, or who won the war. It is chosen daily in small acts of maintaining standards when no one is watching. It is proven by consistent behavior regardless of circumstance. It is built by people who, having every reason to relax standards for convenience, choose excellence instead. The women who left Camp 23 in late 1945 carried that lesson home with them, back to a destroyed nation that needed to learn it more desperately than anything in its history. Some shared it through their work. Some lived it through their choices. Some passed it on to children and grandchildren. And somewhere in that chain of transformation, Germany became something different than it was. Not perfect, not redeemed, but better. Better because people learned that discipline can come from within, that standards maintained from pride outlast standards enforced by fear, that excellence chosen is stronger than excellence imposed, that in the space between propaganda and reality, truth emerges. And sometimes, truth arrives wearing a perfectly pressed British uniform.